All right. Uh, Hello and welcome everyone to this special session of the 2021 Association for Mormon Letters Conference. We are gathered here today to celebrate the work of John Bennion. And my name is Melissa Leilani Larson. I'm the incoming president of the Association for Mormon Letters. I'm really glad to be a part of the conference today. And I'm going to turn the time over to our panel moderator, Darlene Young.
Thank you. I'm so excited to have this opportunity to talk about John and his work. And to give you an idea of what we mean by lifetime achievement, I'm just going to, just because I get to, because I'm the panel chair, talk to you a little bit about how his work has influenced my life. I first became familiar with John's work through his writing. I read Breeding Leah and Other Stories in the early 90s. And I remember saying to a friend, I'm only just barely old enough to read this book. It knocked my socks off. I didn't know Mormon literature could be like that. I particularly remember one short story, The Interview, in which he, with tender compassion, shows two characters, a bishop and a young man dealing with same-gender attraction, in a way that I had never seen done before, with nuance. And I think it really was groundbreaking for the time that it came out, ahead of its time, really. So I read his work. Then I brushed shoulders with him in our work together in the Association for Mormon Letters. I was secretary while he was, I believe he was maybe past president, or maybe you were still president, John. I got to see his work there where he was promoting Mormon literature. Later, as an old person, I went back to graduate school at BYU and got to experience him as a teacher. And those of you who've had him as a student know he is so humble and respectful of his students' desires and what they want to do with their writing. I remember he would bring his own writing even sometimes to workshop and have us look at that. And I was just awed at the humility there. Also, he had to start every class with some kind of joke, or he'd ask us to bring in humorous anecdotes or something. And that's where I got familiar with his sense of humor, which is unique. And finally, then I got to join him as a colleague teaching at BYU. And what I remember, I'm an adjunct teacher, and so I kind of ghost-like haunt the halls at BYU, and I'm not really seen except by John. He will always pull me aside and ask me how my teaching's going, or what I'm writing lately, what my goals are. He still, and I believe he's that way with all his past students as well, but he treats me that way as a colleague as well, remembering me and my work. And just, he's just a fosterer of LDS work among all his students and colleagues. I've appreciated that. Okay, so got my little testimony out of the way. I'm going to turn the time over now to Gideon to read the official citation for this award. Go ahead, Gideon.
Through his career as an author, John Bennion's fiction has been deeply rooted in the West and in the wilderness places, both literal and figurative, that are the backdrop for Mormon history and the Mormon psyche. A reviewer of his short story collection, Breeding Leah and Other Stories, 1991, described Bennion's characters as holding the desert at bay, a phrase labeling a driving theme across Bennion's work, including his candid nonfiction. In Bennion's writing, such as his 2000 novel, Falling Toward Heaven, can be found familiar patterns of Mormon life and the sustaining legacy of religious belief. Yet, these are counterpoised with the stark landscapes of failing families, domestic duress, and the solitary soul at odds with God or himself. Readers of Bennion's fiction are regularly rewarded by wry humor, quirky characters, and pleasantly unexpected circumstances. His more Mormon stories are less stereotypically so. He contributes a fresh and enjoyable idiom to LDS expression, one both authentic to the culture, yet unique to himself. Bennion's two most recent novels, both from 2019, An Unarmed Woman and Ezekiel's Third Wife, playfully take up the murder mystery genre and showcase Bennion's deft use of Mormon history and his keen knowledge of desert life and lore. John Bennion led the Association for Mormon Letters as its president from 1999 to 2000, during which time he not only ran the board and organized AML meetings, but wisely archived the early and robust AML list email discussion board, oversaw the early issues of the literary journal Ariantum, and preserved the proceedings of the Association for Mormon Letters in BYU's Harold B. Lee Library, in addition to making fundraising efforts to sustain the association's activities. Bennion's literary legacy extends beyond his publications to his long career at Brigham Young University as a much-loved and respected teacher and mentor. There, he advised the publication of BYU's creative writing journal, Inscape, training and overseeing multiple student editorial boards. In his wilderness writing course, he regularly took his LDS students away from their keyboards and the safety of classrooms out into the field on camping trips or on hiking ventures across Utah deserts, where observation and conversation elicited literary reflection. With students, he also logged untold hours along the hedgerows and byways of the United Kingdom in his celebrated British Literature and Landscape Study Abroad program. There, he immersed students in the same natural environments that inspired William Wordsworth or George Eliot. Under his good-natured leadership, John Bennion has challenged generations of students to discover the resonance between their outer and inner landscapes, mediated by literature and the reflective and creative practices of authentic personal writing. For his many years of influential literary service and for his personal attainments in achieving a body of entertaining, insightful, and engaging storytelling, the Association for Mormon Letters is pleased to recognize John Bennion with its Lifetime Achievement Award for 2020.
Thank you, Gideon.
Thank
So
you.
I'm going to read the biographies of our four panelists, and then we will go straight through to hear from each one of them. When that's done, I hope to have a little bit of discussion among us. Those of you who are watching live, if you have some particular questions or comments, put them in the comment stream there. If we have time, we'll try to look at some of those and get to some of those. Our session's due to end at 3:30. Our first panelist, Dennis Clark, is a retired librarian living in Orem, Utah. He spends his retirement riding his bike, writing poems, and writhing in pain. Sometimes he has to retire his bike too. Allison Brimley is a fiction writer and a graduate of BYU's Creative Writing MFA program. Her work has appeared in Dialogue, Sunstone, and Western Humanities Review, and she is currently at work on a novel of Mormon historical fiction. She lives in Sandy, Utah, with her husband and daughter. Levi Peterson is a retired professor of English, presently living in Washington State with his wife, Althea. A former editor of Dialogue, he's the author of 3 collections of stories, 2 novels, a prize-winning biography of Juanita Brooks, and an autobiography. The most recent of his collections of stories, Losing a Bit of Eden, was published by Signature Books this spring. Sherry Prey Earl graduated with her master's degree in creative writing from BYU in 1995 and has taught creative writing and literature courses for the BYU Honors Program and the English department for almost 30 years. Sherry worked at as the faculty advisor and managing editor of Insight, the BYU Honors magazine, as a writing coach and writer for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints New Saints History Project, and will take over as the new faculty advisor for Inscape after John retires. She's written freelance articles and essays for the Marriott Alumni Magazine, BYU Honors Writer's Handbook, and Segala, among other publications, but her first love is writing novels for adults and children. We'll turn the time over to you, Dennis.
Well, I should point out that that's dangerous, but that's okay. I'm going to focus my remarks using as a tool John's experimental apocalyptic self-reflective fantasy, Aada at the End of the Earth, a novel he sent to the Re-Eating Group, that's his name for the group incidentally, on 13 November 2017. Now, John knows the group well, so he accompanied the printout with the following note. There is an intense sex scene in the two paragraphs at the bottom of page 41 and the top of page 42. If you don't care to read them, you don't need to. At the time, the group consisted of Charlotte England, Diane and Roland Monson, Bruce and Donna Jorgensen, John and Carla Bennion, and Valerie and me. All of us had at one time or another contributed writing to the group except Valerie. By then, Eugene England and Linda Silito had both died, and Tim and Mary Slover had left the group, and Levi Peterson was a member primarily by longing. So John's novel had a fairly restricted publication. John's note reflected the desire not to offend at least half his audience and to entice the other half. I was not offended. I was, in fact, intrigued. Because as the novel opens, John had returned to the scene of his crime novels and his essays and his family failures, the desert south and west of Rush Valley. And because tomorrow is Fast Sunday, and I am fasting for relief from the drought, which has gripped not only Western North America, but large parts of the entire planet, I find the entire novel a fascinating exercise in extrapolation. The situation is this. Aada is one of the Nua, a wave of immigrants who have come north into the United States as climate refugees. They live outside of the main population center in Utah, which is at this point Salt Lake City. One morning, Aada gets up expecting to see an image that she has seen in a dream. Now, the group, the Nua, live by sleeping during the day in caves and foraging at night. So this is essentially her bedtime, but she gets up to see if this vision happens, and it does. She sees what appears to be a stick figure staggering through the waves of heat against a rising sun, i.e. walking west into the desert towards the cave that she lives in with her group. At that point, I understood exactly nothing about the novel, except that John had returned to the scene of his crime. And I'm not going to tell you an awful lot about it, except to tell you that Aada saves the life of this man whose name is Benson from the family recycling his water, taking his water by slitting his throat, catching the blood, and spinning the blood plasma in a centrifuge out of the water supply, and then adding the water that's left over to their water supply, which is a small cistern trickling into the cave. She saves his life because she believes that that vision she had means something, but she doesn't know what. So the next 20 or so pages is taken up with Aada and Benson wandering out into the desert, following his vision, which is moderated by a link, a device that not only has all kinds of information stored in it, but also the exact coordinates, latitude and longitude, of a buried cask of, or I should say, a buried trove of food, water, and supplies where he can live. I'm going to read 3 excerpts from early in the novel so you get a sense of the way these two people interact, because that is one of the most important parts of the novel. They have found at this point, they have found the cache in Riverbed. And those of you who know John and his essays know where Riverbed is. I was lucky enough to work there with John's grandfather at one point. So this man, Benson, has gone out to Riverbed, and he and Ada have managed to uncover a cask, or rather uncover this storage area, but they haven't been able to open the door yet. And they have both urinated into a still, so they're getting a little bit of water. They listen to the sound of water dropping into the receptacle of the still. Drip. He counted 20 out loud. Another drip. 3 drops per minute. That means 7,000 minutes for a liter of water. Not enough. We don't have that much water anyway, unless you peed a whole liter. We'll get half a cup each. We'll have to do. It's not enough to sustain a person, he said, not without other water. He moved farther into the shade and closed his eyes. At one time, this was the bottom of a lake. She nodded. So our stories say. I try to imagine fish swimming here where we're sitting. When there was an ice age, this was a forest. When your grandfather's grandfather's grandfather was alive, she smiled. You think I'm stupid, he said, telling you all this that you already know. It's difficult to know what history is in your stories and what is not. We have stories that are important about what is important. But what you think is unimportant may be important later. She nodded slightly. Do you remember your great-grandfather? He died when I was 15, so yes. What did he think of his grandfather burying this cache? He thought he was a seer, a profeta, or a visionary, a fool. Not a prophet, not a fool, someone who thought of the future in terms of long segments of time, more than one lifetime. Maybe my great-grandfather dreamed of me before he even came to the city. Eventually, they get the vault open and they are examining the contents. In the dim light from the doorway, she measured the vault, which she discovered was 9 steps by 5 steps. It had 2 metal structures, shelves, that started in the middle and went to the back, and more shelves against the wall. Metal jars covered the shelves. The shelves seemed too thin to support the weight. She walked down the rows, amazed. One shelf would feed the family for a month, and there were 48 shelves. With all this food, maybe women would start conceiving again. Maybe the family could live on. Family is her group. Benson came up behind her as she looked at the rows of jars, speechless with wonder. He lifted down a jar of water and removed the lid. He smelled it and she smelled it. Again, it smelled like nothing. They found cups against the wall above the bed, and each drank 2 cups of water. The water tasted flat, the same way the air smelled. She stood unsteadily and looked at the other jars. Benson read the names: rice, which was a slender white grain many times larger than the seeds they got from rice grass. Wheat, about the same size but brown. Corn, a large yellow grain. Flax, almost like the seeds from rice grass but darker. Quinoa, tan and round. Barley, thicker and lighter than wheat. Oats, much the same as barley. Soy. Ada felt disoriented, dizzy, and she sat down on the floor. Are you all right? Benson asked. Where are the pine nuts? She asked. It had been 5 years since she had eaten a pine nut. No pine nuts that I can see, said Benson. No pine nuts, then what use is all this? What use? Benson glowered at her and she laughed. Finally, she smiled. The second miracle of the day. Yes, what use? That's at the base of the argument between the two of them that continues for the entire novel. This is Benson's cache, and he didn't want to lead anyone to it because he thought he would not be able to live and enjoy it. To Aada, this is exactly what her family needs. And without having it, her family cannot survive. Now, I'm hoping this novel gets published. I'm hoping someone like BCC Press will print it, because what it contains is far more important than just what John's sense of mystery and adventure lends it. It's a wonderful explication of how deep we are into denial at the present time. It's set 200 years in the future, so John gets to reflect on our failure all the time. Anyway, John, I have to tell you, I want this published.
As we all do. Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate that. Okay, next will be Allison.
All right. Well, first, I'm honored by this invitation to participate on this panel as a student of John's and a friend of his. I wish that it were in person so that I could meet my fellow panelists, but alas. John was a teacher of mine in the fiction writing MFA program at BYU and also served as my thesis committee chair. The first thing that comes to mind when I think about my experience with John Bennion as a teacher is just how thoroughly he dissolved the hierarchy of the classroom. And as Darlene mentioned, I think he's the only writing teacher I've ever had who submitted his own first drafts to be workshopped by the class. He's just not interested in preserving any kind of illusions about his superiority to his students. And when I graduated, he told me that we should continue to exchange work, and I did take him up on that. I must admit that as a person who has always kind of hung my identity almost solely on the coat rack of writing, I'm pretty used to having my work praised by my teachers. I was not used to invitations of true camaraderie and the sense of equality that John fostered in his classroom. As I was putting together my thoughts for this panel, I decided to try to nail down why it was that I wanted John to chair my committee. In my career as a writing student, I've had ample opportunities to spend a lot of time thinking about why writers influenced me, but not a lot of time thinking critically about why my teachers have influenced me. There are many excellent teachers of writing in the BYU MFA program, and I could have happily chosen any of them, and any of them would have been excellent mentors to me in writing my thesis. But one reason I think I must have been compelled to want to work more closely with John was that I anticipated and was excited about the level of attention I knew that he would give to my work. A friend of mine in my cohort in the master's program, who I still have a writing group with, when I mentioned that I'd been invited to speak about John on this panel, he told me that John had once spent 3 hours writing feedback on one workshop submission of his. And this wasn't even a thesis piece. It was just a standard submission for a workshop that happened every week. And this kind of thing, I think, was not unique to him. I think that was pretty common. Another kind of obvious thing that drew me to John was that of all the creative writing faculty at BYU, he was most strongly identified, at least in my mind, with Mormon literature. And that's what I wanted to write. And it also seemed to me like the most challenging aspect of what I wanted to write in a lot of ways, and the one I most craved mentorship in. I could be misremembering, but I don't believe that I had yet taken a class from John Bennion when I happened across a copy of his book, Towards Heaven, at Bennion Books. As I recall, I read it over the summer before I started my MFA in 2016, when I hadn't yet met John, but knew I would be working with him. I read it immediately after having finished another novel on a similar theme as Falling Toward Heaven. This other novel was a more recently published one about a young man grappling with his faith in the mission field. This book had been published by a major house and nominated for awards whose names I recognized, and therefore its very existence served as a beacon of hope for a writer like me who hoped to write about Mormons, but not only for Mormons. But after finishing this other novel, I felt kind of dissatisfied. I was left with the sense that someone unfamiliar with my religion who had never given much thought to the lived experience of a Mormon missionary might glean some insight into the possible conflicts and turmoils inherent in such a situation. But for someone like me who had served a mission and also set out on this difficult but actually very well-traveled path of deconstructing my Orthodox Mormon faith, I felt this novel had much less to offer. It reminded me too of a similar story I had read years earlier, prior to my mission, in a well-regarded literary magazine. Reading the first lines of this story, my heart lifted to discover that it was all about Mormon missionaries. I had no concept then that the wider world might recognize us Mormons as worthy subjects for literature at all. In this story too, the portrayal of the missionaries' loss of faith felt too simplistic. Either you were an obedient, by the white handbook type of elder, or you abandoned your companion and slept with the ward mission leader's wife. This kind of story didn't feel true to my experience thus far, and would come to feel even more of an insult when I later served a mission myself and was introduced to the many complex interactions of faith and obedience. I guess I just didn't really feel respected by either of these missionary stories. By contrast, from the opening pages of Falling Towards Heaven, I knew my experience with it would be different. Immediately, the prose itself felt refreshingly layered. In the beginning of this book, we're introduced to many flavors of Mormons. The stereotypical eager elder feels the spirit guiding him to doors as firmly as a physical hand, but hardly shies away from a discussion of sex, even with potential investigators. The less eager elder who sees God as an abusive father and feels the need to defend himself to others with the claim that not all Mormons are conservative. There's a tossed-off mention of a Mormon who begins to see himself in the book of Revelation and plots to throw his children off a spire of the Salt Lake City temple. Characters converse easily about the Mormon women's participation in the International Women's Year. These elders hold within them the capacity to be both serious and casual about their work and about their beliefs, and for all kinds of reasons. But the character that I still remember best years after reading was the main character, Howard's mother, who as a Relief Society president begins secretly using her husband's priesthood to bless women in the ward as they deal with various hardships. Why did this detail stick in my mind? Possibly because she was so clearly a character we're meant to sympathize with rather than condemn. And I, in my own state of religious insecurity, was possibly hypersensitive to any detail that might give me the barest insight into the beliefs of my own professors at BYU. Possibly because of what that one detail signaled. For none of these characters was disobedience a force opposing faithfulness. Both tendencies were at work in all of the characters. Of course, this is true in the real world, the dissolution of this binary. But to that point, it had not quite been true in my world. And I still felt like then that maybe I was the first one to think about it, and certainly the first one to try to write about it. I had not read much Mormon literature then, and still have read much less than I would wish. But immediately the book felt, and still does in my memory, rich. I couldn't help but feel that some of the accolades and honors that had been heaped on the aforementioned missionary stories would be better deserved by this book, and that if the world had more stories like John's to draw upon when forming its views of Mormons, I might be less reticent about admitting to it that I am one. All this to say, I guess, that I trusted John Bennion, the author, when I was acting as his reader. I trusted him as a writer of Mormons like me in a way that I didn't trust many others. And I think without my conscious awareness, this translated into this translated into my feeling that I trusted him with my writing and my Mormon characters. And that trust isn't easy to earn. I, like many of us, come from a culture that bred into me a kind of suspicion of divergent thinking and awareness that my own words and actions would be treated with the same suspicion. The stakes became especially high for me when it came to my stories, as I worried they would expose something about me I wasn't sure I wanted to be exposed. I would not share these stories with my parents, for example. Trying to write good fiction under these conditions seemed especially difficult in retrospect, but I sensed John would be able to help, and I was right. I remember a particular story I wrote during grad school that dealt with a past abortion in the life of a woman who was an observant member of the church. At certain points in the story, John's feedback, without being at all prescriptive, encouraged me to delve into what this woman's actual beliefs or justifications might have been regarding her choice. Of course, there would be questions in her mind that could not be answered by official church sources, and into such gaps in the doctrine, individual, unsanctioned beliefs always flood in with their seductive powers to explain. John went so far as to supply me with a few of these specific beliefs surrounding unborn babies that he knew of. Exceptionally helpful since I was writing about a character decades older than myself, and it seems this kind of folk doctrine is sometimes hard to access since it's passed on in private by word of mouth and often die off with the generations that held them. John was encouraging me to think about what this woman would have done with the body and believed about the spirit of her never-born child. I'm not sure why this one piece of feedback has endured in my mind, except that it represented something I think I wanted and needed in my writing. Feedback that would not only incorporate the rules of good fiction writing generally, but also acknowledge the weirdnesses of Mormon belief specifically, and not shy away from those things in the interest of making my characters understandable to a non-Mormon or even non-religious audience. These weirdnesses are everything, and John gets that. Since it's a heavy responsibility to represent many of John's many students to this panel, before I close, I'd just like to share a few comments from some of my fellow students about what John's mentorship has meant to them. So these are not my words. These are other people's words that I'll just read quickly in closing. One said, I remember meeting in his office one afternoon to discuss my MFA thesis, and he had just returned from a meeting with the rest of the department, carrying a basket of candy and looking disheartened. When I asked him what the candy was for, he half jokingly, half seriously told me that it had been meant as a bribe. However, the meeting hadn't gone as he hoped, he said. At my curiosity, he revealed that he had been pushing for more recognition of young adult literature in the curriculum, but that many still did not believe the genre to be an acceptable or valid field of study. Apparently, this was not the first time he had come up against a wall with the discussion, and his dejection was palpable. But as I sat there about to consult with him on my young adult thesis, I felt far from discouraged. In fact, I was impressed that he had even tried at all, that he cared so much, and that he would continue to fight for the genre that so many students secretly or not so secretly enjoy. But that's who John is, someone who cared, who fights for what he believes in, who is more than a little happy to be a rebel in all aspects of his life. Another said, I had a rough go of making it through grad school with medical drama and a series of disheartening setbacks pushing me to question if I belonged there at all, or if I was even cut out to be a writer. John got me through it. His kindness and practical advice, his dogged belief in me, his gentle humor, and his steady dedication. John shows up for people when it matters most. He's there. So I'm grateful for this opportunity that I've had to spend just a fraction of the amount of time thinking about John's writing and his work that he's spent on mine. I'm certain that my thesis and my writing generally, my instinct for writing is better for his influence. And I'd like to add also that after hearing John ask me many times during my MFA when I was going to write a novel, and me answering that I had no novel ideas, I only wanted to write short stories, he's finally gotten to me. I've now been working on a novel for the last 2.5 years. I think I can finish it in another 10 to 12 years. So we'll see. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Allison. That was great. Okay, Levi.
Okay, can you hear me? Well, I'm kind of glad you can't see me. I'm happy to be a participant on this occasion. From the moment John and Carla joined the writing group to which Althea and I belonged in 1991, they have been among our dearest friends. I've enjoyed reading all of John's books, stories, and essays. I'm grateful for the opportunity to refresh myself on this present occasion. For my remarks today, I'd like to focus on his novel, Falling Toward Heaven, published by Signature Books in the year 2000. This novel strikes me as John's magnum opus, his masterpiece. I believe it deserves particular recognition as a classic of Mormon literature. Had it appeared before my retirement at Weber State University, I would certainly have included it in my course in Western American literature. Falling Toward Heaven features the unlikely coupling of a doubt-plagued but ultimately loyal Latter-day Saint named Howard Rockwood and a cynical, sexually liberated atheist named Allison Warren. The two eventually fuse into a permanently bonded couple following the loss of a stillborn child. They meet in Houston, Texas, near the end of an LDS mission. Howard plans to return to his home in Rockwood, Utah, Rockwood being a fictional name for Bennion's hometown, Vernon. Allison, who is a highly competent freelance coder of software for oil companies, has signed on for a lucrative job in Anchorage with a software company serving oil production on the North Slope of Alaska. Howard is susceptible to falling in love with the atheistic Allison because his testimony has been shaken by the violence of the Old Testament and the inequities between the rich and the poor in Houston. Quoting, "If God is in charge," Howard thought, "then he is unpredictable, arbitrary, even cruel, an abusive father." A simpler explanation was that the governing spirit of the cosmos was chaos, end quote. I won't go into the antipodal off and on nature of the attraction of Howard and Allison to each other in Houston, other than to say that on the evening Howard is supposed to be flying home to Utah at the end of his mission, he agrees to drive with her to Anchorage to test whether they want each other enough to justify marriage. They pause briefly in Rockwood, where Howard shocks and scandalizes friends and relatives by brazenly making his new cohabitation with Allison known. Before their brief visit is over, Allison comes to realize that Howard is deeply bonded to the town and particularly to the family's ancestral ranch some 40 miles westward in Utah's barren West Desert. She also realizes that by coupling with her, Howard has jilted a fiancée without any forewarning. Once they are in Alaska, things go well for Allison, who works long hours and makes big money. Howard takes and quickly abandons a variety of menial jobs, all the while realizing that he has a visceral need to be in Rockwood, preparing to replace his aging father on the ranch. Disappointed to find that the University of Alaska offers nothing resembling a range management major, he must wait till winter semester to enroll in a general biology major, which could position him for graduate work in something like coastal zoology. Ironically, things improve for Howard when he is summoned back to Rockwood for a disciplinary action by the High Council of his Utah state. As it turns out, he is disfellowshipped rather than excommunicated after having reported to the High Council that he and Allison have married, a formidable concession on her part because she equates marriage with female servitude. Finding his faith in Mormonism renewed, Howard hopes, in vain as the future proves, that Allison will convert. Allison insists that in the event of her death, Howard not do, as she says, quote, "those Mormon things to me," by which she means temple work. "None of it," she says. "Swear to me. I want none of it done to me. It's a lie. You shouldn't give hope to anybody when there is no hope, especially not to yourself." Howard's and Allison's relationship remains conflicted. She keeps busy, flying off to the North Slope for 2 weeks at a time, while Howard reads Westerns and otherwise mopes in Anchorage. Eventually, they come close to breaking up. Frightened by the near rupture, they affirm their marriage and agree to remain in Alaska until he completes an undergraduate degree. Even more importantly, they agree to have a baby, although they fail to agree conclusively on how to manage the impact of their opposing worldviews upon the child. Allison's pregnancy proves difficult, and when she goes into labor, those attending her can find no fetal heartbeat, and they perform an emergency C-section. The child is stillborn, and the couple are tumbled into a deep grief. The event also proves to be a religious shock to Howard, because he has prayed fervently and felt a spiritual confirmation that all would be well with the mother and child. The bereaved couple send the tiny coffin containing their daughter's body to Rockwood for burial, where they visit in order to see the grave after Allison has fully recovered. Then they return to Alaska, where they plan to stay until Howard finishes his degree. Chastened by circumstances, they have bonded into a permanent couple. Successful fiction depends upon an author's creative imagination, a quality that John amply demonstrates in Falling Toward Heaven. Like other artists, fiction writers use models. I conjecture that John modeled Howard on himself, John having declared in various venues a never-to-be-realized longing to have a ranch in Utah's West Desert. As for Allison, John informed me by email that one of his instructors told him that his novel, quote, needed an outsider as a main character so that explanations of Mormon culture would seem natural. That was what made me want to write her. She is probably a composite of the women I met in my PhD program in Houston, end quote. Allison is a powerful, complex, and realistic character, demonstrating John's grasp on a feminine point of view, a grasp further demonstrated by the significant subplot involving Howard's mother, Emily, to which Allison Mayer Brimley has just alluded. I will point out that John's recent novels, An Unarmed Mother and Ezekiel's Third Wife, present an intelligent, strong-willed female protagonist. I would also like to emphasize that Falling Toward Heaven is a tragedy. As defined by Aristotle, tragedy is a depiction of events in a drama that arouse pity and terror in the viewer, thereby effecting a catharsis or a purging of these painful emotions. This definition applies readily to fiction as well, as this novel demonstrates. The birth and burial of Howard's and Allison's stillborn child is depicted in the final 20 pages of the novel. That depiction evokes slumbering griefs in me each time I read it, particularly because I think it derives from the stillbirth of a child of John and Carla near the end of their stay in 1989 at the University of Houston. They named their child Lucy, and she is buried in the Vernon Cemetery, where, as John informs me, he and Carla intend to be interred. In an essay titled The Chimerical Desert, published in BYU Studies a couple of years after their return from Houston, John discusses the influence of Utah's West Desert on him and his ancestors. His grandfather, Glenn Bennion, disillusioned with Mormonism, sequestered himself like an impoverished hermit at a ranch in the West Desert, whereas his wife, John's grandmother, Lucille Cannon Bennion, a resident of Salt Lake City, remained sturdily faithful. Quote, I have inherited both my grandfather's distrust of ill-used ecclesiastical power and my grandmother's love of matters of the spirit, John writes. Like my grandfather, I'm uncomfortable in a culture that holds both agency and authority as absolute values. I feel beset by ironies, but because of my grandmother, I claim membership in the culture that I question, grasping this opportunity to serve God's children. Because of her, I know that my stillborn daughter is safe. Because of my grandfather, I still curse God for taking her from me. Carla, for her part, published 2 poems about Lucy in dialogue. If I can keep my composure, I will conclude my remarks by reading one of the poems, which is entitled Losing Lucy. Just as we were meeting, she slid quickly away, too far, and I, surprised at sudden loss, ran leaping after her. My eyes still fixed on her bright face, I feel by want of breath how high I had lifted from the ground, abyss of air beneath. I reached, but she had turned, cruel heart, to a remoter view, and the deep fall back is decades long, and dizzy, down I go. In conclusion, I will say that the grieving spirit of this poem infuses the final pages of Falling Toward Heaven. Truly, the novel makes a fitting memorial for Lucy. Moreover, as I said in my opening remarks, because of the gripping tensions of its plot and the lifelike intensity of its characterization, I believe this novel deserves recognition as a classic of Mormon literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Levi. All right, Sherry.
Well, first of all, I want to say I am impressed at how well John's friends and colleagues know him. That's incredible. I struggled with this tribute as well because John knows what a cut up I am. So I'm trying to be serious and promise not to mention anything that could be compromising. With that said, John has been a patient friend and mentor to me for the almost 30 years I've known him. In fact, I knew him before I met him when I read Benediction when I was an undergraduate at BYU. We worked on writing conferences together, been in critique groups together, and we are colleagues at BYU. He listens without complaint, but not without that, I don't know what to say to that face that he gives me when I start ranting and raving over the injustices in the world, especially BYU, and my frequent teasings about his chaos of books and papers flung all over the place in his office. And by the way, he's usually reading a student's writing or working on something for a student when I come knocking, usually multiple students, or he has a student in his office. His door is literally almost always open, which I think says a lot about John as a teacher and a mentor. If I want a deep dive, unbiased, and much needed critique on a manuscript, I go to John. And our on again, off again critique group of 2 has been one of my favorite associations with him. He's an insightful reader and a compassionate critic. But I still wonder how in the world does he manage to acknowledge audience, believability, probability, possibility, the art of it all, the demands of literary fiction, not to mention what an exploration of the human condition has to look like to be credible, while at the same time showing compassion for me, the writer, in his comments on my awkward, wobbling novel. When I read someone's manuscript, I blaze through it like a blowtorch, writing terse critiques in the margins and sprinkling in supportive comments here and there after the fact. I have to remind myself to add the supportive bits, actually. John's comments are all supportive, even as they are critical. He takes the time to explain in detail why he likes an image or a word or a paragraph or a character, why a bit works, which highlights clearly what doesn't work. How can he do that? I don't know, but I have learned from him that it takes time to be a mentor. More than anything else, you have to give your time to mentor people. I want to be the mentor that he is. John, I hope I don't embarrass you, but I'm going to share part of a critique you gave me on one of our novels about 3 years ago, one of my drafts, because you reveal yourself and your own personal struggles to me and show me that my story has affected you, which has got to be the best compliment a writer could receive on a draft. This is just a really short part of one comment John wrote on 30 pages of a novel I sent to him. And this is John. The essence of this novel seems to be how to learn how to love, period. The main character is discovering, possibly, that she didn't know how to love. Ironically, I recently finished a season of a British detective series, River, in which the detective learns how to love. Carla and I have been talking about this, having really good talks that are excruciating. When I look at my past, I can see that I have been so superficial. It really hurts to see that. It's so difficult and painful. That's what this novel can be. If the writing of the novel rips you apart, it will be deep and significant writing. I'm not sure that I've written anything except one essay that does this, but it's a choice. Using the detective example, do you want to write NCIS or river? End quote. He ended the critique, which is much longer than this excerpt, by the way, by saying, this is a strong novel on the verge of deepening into a significant novel. So you can see he's giving me the support while at the same time cautioning me. Stay on the right path. Wow, that was the perfect conclusion to keep me writing, by the way, John. I don't think I ever told you that. You took the time with me that I needed and gave of yourself in the process. You're a great mentor and a great friend. John also practices in his own writing what he preaches to me about mine. He has dabbled in mystery novels almost since I've known him. However, he writes mysteries that define him, in part at least, as a novelist who explores his own faith and religious heritage within the usually harsh world his characters inhabit. As I read his novels, I can see him figuring out what sort of person he is as he scratches out the words, figuring out what he believes, figuring out his faith, exploring it all as he sketches his religion and his family into a story on the page in front of him. I see him realizing the myriad ways, as he wrote in an essay in 1997, in which people separate themselves from their true selves before God. Like Raymond Chandler in his detective novel, The Big Sleep, John widens his lens beyond just the mystery to be solved in his novel, beyond what critics consider the simplistic, even template elements of genre fiction. In his essay, The Simple Art of Murder, Chandler suggests that genre fiction can be art, high art even. And Chandler says, it is always a matter of who writes the stuff and what he has in him to write it with. So what does John have in him? His writings would tell you that he has an endless penchant for self-exploration. His 2006 essay, Like the Lilies of the Field, is an excellent example of that, and the one essay that John feels, as he mentioned, rips you apart. But self-exploration is only a small portion of John's project as a writer. In his mysteries, he cracks open his grandmother's steamer trunk in the attic and explores the imperfect treasures of his ancestors, his religion, his own spirituality, and the Utah landscape. He has within him a rooted curiosity about people in general, not just in himself, and a maddening compassion for them, I might add, except for the unlucky authoritarian in fiction and especially in real life. No compassion there. He doesn't just write a mystery, he explores the complexity and ambiguity in the question at the heart of literary fiction. What does it mean to be human? In his 1997 essay, Popular and Literary Mormon Novels, Can Wayland and Whipple Dance Together in the House of Fiction, which John probably doesn't even know I read, John joins the conversation about what LDS fiction should be and what it should not be. We live in a universe that God designed to be difficult, he says, a test of our mettle, and realistic literary novels can help us learn about existence in the universe. The irony is that John writes popular fiction, doesn't he? Also, he confesses in his essay, And Will to Your Face, that LDS popular literature should have a place at the table. Each of the two genres, popular and literary fiction, fulfills a distinct but different narrative aim, he says. Popular fiction, as its label indicates, is literature of the people. It stresses solidarity of cultural values at the expense of serious questioning of those values. Literary fiction stresses complexity and ambiguity at the expense of reverence for tradition. One designs to shore up community, one shows how experience deconstructs some communal values and strengthens others. At the end of this essay, John encourages LDS writers to blur the distinction between the literary and the popular because both aims are worthy. He says literary writers might concern themselves with translating spirituality into a humanistic and rationalistic medium, which he says is excruciatingly hard to do, by exploring ways of writing intimately about spiritual struggle. This is exactly what John does in his mystery fiction in a deeply personal and personally revealing way. His real spiritual and private struggles are played out on the page in his stories, and by writing through the complexity and ambiguity of his own life, he reveals what he has in him to write with. I want to end my tribute to John where I began, by praising him as a teacher and mentor. I asked six of his former students who worked with him on the staff of BYU's Inscape magazine to share their thoughts about John as their teacher and mentor. I'll read a few excerpts and end with a short video the Inscape editors Rebecca Kazanavi and Catherine Richards recorded. And John, I'll send the full text of all of these to you. I'll send you a link so you can read them all. First, the excerpt. This is from Lisa Christensen, an MFA student and nonfiction editor on Inkscape. She says, one of John's greatest strengths as a faculty advisor on Inkscape, I think, is his ability to communicate difficult concepts so perfectly and with the most memorable language possible. At the beginning of this year, for example, he drifted into a meeting. I love the way she says that, John. I mean, we were on Zoom, right? He drifted into a meeting in which the nonfiction staff and I were trying to decide what our rubric would be. Rubrics are great ways to quantify taste before innate taste has developed. So we were discussing scaling things like the amount of reflection in a piece and how conclusive the ending was. As we were trying to define what makes a piece memorable, John said, it should hang on the doorknob of your mind. We kind of laughed, but I put it down on the list. And she goes on to say that they use that as their rubric for the rest of the semester. This next excerpt is from Thomas Jensen, who was on the poetry staff at Inkscape. I don't know if there has ever been another two-dimensional box on my computer screen that has more depth of character than John Bennion. He's talking about Zoom, of course. I'm torn about what I appreciate most about him, his delightful quips in the Slack thread, the way he sometimes forgets to unmute himself before he talks, or the fact he is so genuinely invested in his students that he would go to any lengths to support them. This next excerpt is from Dallin Hunt, who was an MFA student and fiction genre editor for Inkscape. When John was my professor, I talked his ear off most days, and there were probably several days that I kept him from getting to his next class on time. When he was my thesis chair, I sent him plenty of long and frantic emails and demanded multiple emergency Zoom meetings. And without fail, he always listened and responded thoroughly, thoughtfully, and enthusiastically. How he managed to do so while also working with dozens of other students, many of whom might even have demanded as much attention as me, is really miraculous. And this last excerpt is from Sarah Schultzke, who was on the Inkscape fiction staff. Hers was quite long, actually, and personal, but so I had to really dig for what I thought was the core. With the experiential writing website, which she and John worked on, he was always willing to accept feedback on his articles and express sincere thanks for that feedback, as well as acknowledge when he was wrong. His enthusiasm about my editing suggestions made me feel confident as an editor and also helped me feel that I was actually contributing to something rather than just being given an opportunity to practice. In meetings and other settings, I felt like if I had an opinion, I was not just allowed but encouraged to express it. I'm sure this was true of everyone, and it helped the whole team thrive individually and as a unit. The world needs more educators like John Bennion. It needs more educators that are compassionate, that put their students' needs, course-related and otherwise, first, that know learning doesn't come from rote memorization, but from active participation. Educators that want students to be successful in life, not just in their class. In the words of my therapist, when she found out he was my supervisor, John Bennion is a legend, which I have to agree for so many reasons. Now I want to share the video as the end of my remarks from the two Inkscape editors, Rebecca and Catherine. So if you will bear with me for a moment. Can you see it? Hold on, sorry. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, you know what? That's too bad because I forgot to optimize something. So just a minute. Just mix and mingle, talk amongst yourself.
While we're waiting, I just want to say, those of you who are watching live on YouTube, if you have a question or something you'd like to discuss, put that in your chat there and we'll try to get to it if we have time.
Okay. There's a ton of things that we love about John Bennion.
John's a fantastic mentor. He's the reason I'm in grad school today. He's cheered on my novel through all the thesis crisis I had. He asks students if he can read their novels. He gives really great, genuine feedback. Super willing to help all the time.
Yeah, he's really unique in his relationship with his students. He really cares about them and cares about them succeeding in a way that is just so involved and so personal.
Yeah, I think students are definitely John Bennion's #1 priorities. He has so many responsibilities with his extra projects, his own writing, all the things that he does as a professor, but he always manages to keep students the focus. He's also an awesome boss. Kath and I have both worked with him on Inkscape. I manage a project for him for a grant, and he works with students. He doesn't only mentor you by telling you how to do something and giving you feedback. He literally works alongside students, writing, being edited by students, as well as editing for students. And I think that's really awesome. He helps a ton of people that way.
Yeah, I've just been working with him for the last year, but he just like immediately takes me and every other student he works with right under his wing and wants to mentor and help and takes interest in your interests. He really is just so awesome.
And maybe one of my favorite things about John, it's hard to pick, but John is super humble and super open-minded. He's always willing to consider alternative points of view, alternative ways to do things. And I super admire you, John. Congratulations. We're so happy.
Congrats, John.
See ya.
Okay, thank you. You're done, Sherry? Are you done? Okay, didn't want to cut you off. Wonderful. We've heard so many great things. I love that we've had people address him as teacher and as writer and as a writing group partner and as colleague. So many great things. I'm going to give Gideon Burton a few minutes to share some comments, and then I'd like to hear from John himself. Go ahead, Gideon.
Thanks. This has been a pleasure to be reminded of some of John's works. That it's been a while since I've looked at them, and it's reminded me of many pleasant moments of reading his fiction and his works. I wanted to just make a comment or two about as one of the instructors who teaches the LDS literature course at BYU, the way that John's works have been challenging to the LDS BYU students in just the right ways. I find that, for example, when he represents missionaries, it's never in a kind of simplistic or stereotypical way. We have a lot of recently returned missionaries in the classrooms at BYU, and there's a lot of effort to sort of preserve a kind of standard script for what missionary experience is like, and we probably all know the cultural reasons for that. But John pushes people beyond those stereotypes, and yet does that in his prose in a way that it's engaging on a human and a humane level. So it doesn't feel like it's an assault on anything, but it doesn't let you hold still with your received notions. And that's exactly the sweet spot for literary instruction, especially in an LDS classroom dealing with real issues in a real way. So I appreciate that. And I also wanted to say, I got an email from the secretary in the English department the other day, and she was asking me, how are you going to replace John Bennion? And what she was referring to was that John and I are on a committee, the advisement committee for the English department. And with John leaving, I needed to get someone else on the committee. And of course, her putting it that way, I was just like, there's no replacing John Bennion. But I just wanted to mention that what he did on that committee was he was always the person who volunteered to meet with and deal with the students who were on academic probation. And it was just a matter of course for John to do that. This is the hardest task, where students are in danger of actually getting, booted out of BYU because of their academic record. And John, I think, has been very good to minister to students. And I use that word very consciously. He is someone who cares. And those tributes from those students, Sherry, that's great to hear those, and very much of a piece with what I've seen at close hand as a colleague. So John, it's a pleasure, and you are not replaceable. Keep writing, and let's see that other book get published.
Thank you. All right, John, what do you want to put out there?
Well, this is a very difficult thing it feels like I've just attended my own funeral, because I mean, that's exactly what it feels like. But anyway, so it's both gratifying and awkward, but I have to say, I'm not dead yet. We have Mike Austin and I have had a conversation that we hope, I think will be published in Literature and Belief, and I have an essay on my family that's going to be published in Blossom as the Cliff Rose, which is an anthology of environmental type writing published by Torrey House Press. And there's the Journal of Mormon History is going to publish an essay on my great-great-grandmother's poetry that I've written. So I'm still writing. I have not just one, but 5 unpublished novels. And I have said goodbye to realism. So there we are. Not, yeah. Anyway, I don't have much else to say. I appreciate your careful comments, and they were very gratifying to me. Thank you very much for this, Darlene, for organizing this panel, and for you guys for participating on it. It's been a very nice experience, even though I feel a little bit intimidated.
You know, I'd like to comment that it's been really nice to have a reason to go back through John's writings. I appreciate being invited to be involved. And when I realized what I was going to say was only going to last 10 or 12 minutes anyway, it didn't matter. It was a good refresher on some very powerful literature.
So Levi, I'm glad that you spoke up about that. One of the questions that we got from the people watching on YouTube was someone looking for recommendation of what is a good entry point to John's work. And I think, Levi, you're probably a good one to answer that question.
Well, I recommend Falling Toward Heaven, but his essays, the influence of the desert on John, I think it's a good introduction to his personality and the fact he couldn't be a rancher in the West Deserts had a lot of impact on what's happened to him in life. And so maybe some of the essays he's written is a good place to start too.
I want to chime in on that. I don't disagree with Levi. Those are good starting points, but I would like to have my students read Breeding Leah and other stories, but it's hard to come by. And so maybe as a counterbalance to all this praise, I can bring up one small negative, and that is not all of your work is easily available, John. How about an ebook version at least? I would love to be able to bring students into some of those.
Yes, I second that about your essays, John. Is there a way you can put them on a blog or something?
I'm working on my website where I'll have copies of all of that stuff. So I'm behind on that, but I do have a plan for getting access to the essays and so forth. I'll have to think about Breeding Leah.
So I heard you say that you've left realism behind. Do you want to talk a little bit about that choice?
I don't mean that I've left it behind, of course not, but I don't know that everything I start to write now seems to be kind of sprung realism, so that it's not Ada at the end of the earth is clearly science fiction, but the other things I'm working on are not exactly realistic. The novel has been accepted by Common Consent Press, which is called Spin. Our friend Bruce Jorgensen helped name that, but it's about a woman who lost her child through a bad divorce, her baby, and she can't, her husband is so powerful that he, through the 3 years of their marriage, has stripped away all her friends, kind of just isolated her. And she's an orphan. And so when the divorce comes through, he uses his lawyers and people he hires and behind the scenes computer people to strip away all her assets. And he thinks that that will make her kind of bow to him, and he's going to set her up in an apartment and she'll be his prisoner, kind of. And what she does is she finds this wheel in, I have it. She finds this wheel in a DI. And Chris Crow gave this to me. I believe it was Chris Crow. But it's an executive, it says executive decision maker on the bottom. So you spin it and it makes decisions for you. And so she figures out that rationality has not been her friend, and there's no way she's going to get back to her child by logical means. So she spins this wheel and it takes her, like the Urim Thummim, back to her child. She kidnaps it and runs away, eventually getting to Canada with the child. So that playfulness that sprung realism allows is really inviting to me. And of course, I haven't left realism behind. But, yeah.
Right. And Sherry, you've responded here to our chat on the Zoom with a suggestion, but I don't think the people on the YouTube feed will see that. Could you tell us your suggestion?
Yeah. Melissa, or Allison, sorry, can talk to this probably more too. But as she was pointing out, digging into a novel for the first time, if you want to be an LDS writer, and you have an aversion to writing template fiction, which John does not do. Mystery is a genre, right? It's genre fiction, but he approaches genre fiction very thoughtfully, and he includes all of those great themes that you hear in his essays as well, especially family relationships. Ada and the end of the earth, at the end of the earth is also that. I know that John talks about the biological family, you know, the father, mother, and him as a son kind of thing that he works on in his essays and in his fiction sometimes. But I really see more male-female relationships. Whenever I see, this back and forth between Ada and Benson, I'm hearing Carla and John. I see that in a lot of his fiction. And so he is a great model, I think, for LDS writers, young LDS novelists especially, who want to know how to incorporate their beliefs into a novel in a way that isn't preachy or just informative or just follows sort of a traditional route. But that's me. I love murder mysteries too. So I'm also biased toward that genre.
I have a further response to that. Is it just feels like strict realism doesn't explain life adequately, and especially not Mormon life adequately. We believe in things that people think of as magical realism or fantasy or whatever. And so when we're writing literal, what some Mormon could actually believe, it doesn't feel realistic to much of the world. So I think that that's another reason to write sprung realism.
So go ahead.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't. I'm responding to William Morris. Doug Thayer was absolutely essential to my thinking as a writer, especially Under the Cottonwoods, which talks about bringing a physical story inside. So many of the stories are meditative, and so they're focused specifically on spirituality and philosophical and other concerns. And some of his stories are outside and full of action, but many of them are where a character is drawn in. And that was profoundly important to me. And the other writer who's been very important to me is Levi Peterson, whose stories about the desert resonated with me, and his stories about Mormonism resonated with me all along. So, and then of course, Virginia Sorensen and Maureen Whipple. Virginia Sorensen is such a sophisticated writer. And then there are so many young adult writers who are important to me, but specifically Louise Plummer and Carol Lynch Williams.
So one more question. This may take us to the end. You're not dead yet, John. but you are retiring, and we've had the retirements of, Bruce Jorgensen retired, was it last year or the year before? It feels like there's a little bit of a turnover in generations among people who have been advocates of Mormon literature and producers of it. And you and Levi and Dennis have seen a lot over the course of AML and of the things that have been done in LDS literature. I would like to hear you talk about what you've seen and what you hope for in terms of LDS literature.
Well, as Michael said last night, his last name just went out of my head. I'm so sorry, but
Austin, Michael Austin. You mean?
Well, anyway, he and I had a conversation, Michael Austin and I, and the one I mentioned will probably be published. And BYU is really not interested in developing a culture for Mormon literature that is self-examining, and never has been, but it was a time the center of the AML, but now it's not. And so I think that things that many writers have had successes in the national press by not talking about Mormonism, but there are tons of people right now who they're making inroads in the national press and dealing with spirituality that comes from their Mormonism. And there's a great book on the Book of Mormon that has been published, which is an American Studies classic, and its name has gone out of my head now, but that kind of thing where a great press, a university press or national press, picks up and takes on a Mormon without apologizing for it is I hope the wave of the future. I'm stumbling over words, but the Book of Mormon Girl and a lot of novels, some novels now include Mormon details and are published in national presses. And the Association for Mormon Letters is alive and vital, as is BCC Press and Signature Books and so on. So anyway, it's not going to happen at BYU, but it's happening online and in some national places. That was a confused rendition. By sprung realism, I mean you have a device and it's supposed to be square, but somebody's sat on it. Now it's kind of
Good image.
not square anymore. And that's sprung realism. Everything's supposed to be logical and normal, but it's not. It's not. And so it's just twisted a little bit.
Write about Mormons and sin and turmoil.
Yeah.
So question is, what would you like to talk a little bit about your next, what you're going to be working on next, John?
Well, Carla has always said that my essayistic voice is my own voice, and that I adopt some weird voice for my novels. And that's always uncomfortable for me to hear that, but she does like my voice in this new novel that I've written 5 chapters of. And it sounds like a joke when I explain it to people. But there's a guy who, his wife, he's my age, and his wife has had an affair. Their marriage is not doing well, and she has an affair. And so he leaves and goes out into the desert and lives in this trailer that doesn't have a door on it. It just has a blanket over the doorway, and it's filthy. And he's living out there, and he does it so that he can be alone. But to his great anger and unhappiness, every night, 3 of his dead ancestors come to his trailer and want to play poker with him. And so he can never be alone. And so I'm really having fun with this novel. It feels comic, and feels like it feels open enough that I can talk about a lot of different things that concern me, but I'm having a lot of fun with it so far. 5 chapters.
Great. I think this is a pretty good place to end. I want to just repeat something that Allison said that just has stuck with me about when she was discovering the works of John Bennion. She said, this was an author I realized that I could trust, and I could trust him as an author of Mormon literature. And she was talking about he got the Mormon right, but he got the humanity right, and also that he got the writing right. And I think that's a great just summary of what it is we love about the work of John Bennion. I'm so grateful to have been able to know you and interact with you, John, and all of us here are, and all of the people who are your fans, both readers and past students and colleagues. Thank you for the great work you've done for LDS literature. I think we should all just clap for John.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you all for joining us. Mel, I'm turning it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I feel like I'm just the luckiest fly on the wall to get to have heard it. Thank you, John, for your work, both as a writer and as an educator. And we're all going to hold you to it, that you keep writing. You would better. We're going to end this session now, and hope you all will stick around. In a couple minutes, we're going to shift our focus to the wonderful work of Stephen Peck. So thanks very much for being with us, everybody. And